There are pots still sitting on the floor. Not broken, not buried under 1,000 years of rockfall. Just sitting there, right side up, where someone set them down. Sandals by the doorway. Corn still in the storage rooms. Grinding stones resting exactly where the last hands left them. In some of the rooms the doorways were sealed shut from the outside, as if the people meant to come back and never did. By the year 1280, one of the most sophisticated societies in North America walked out of these cliffs and left the lights on. And for over a century, the story we were told was simple. There was a drought, the crops failed, the people died out, mystery solved. But that story is wrong. It is wrong about how they left, wrong about why they left, and wrong about the most important part of all, which is that they did not vanish. What actually emptied Mesa Verde is stranger, slower, and far more human than a drought. It is one of the first great economic collapses in the history of this continent, and almost everything you think you know about it is a story someone else told for you. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Let me take you back before any of this happened, because to understand a collapse, you have to understand what was there to fall. Mesa Verde is not a single ruin. It is an entire lost country, folded into the canyons and mesas of what is now the southwest corner of Colorado. The name means green table in Spanish, and from a distance that is exactly what it looks like, a high flat forest of piñon and juniper lifted above the desert floor. People lived here for roughly 700 years. That number is worth sitting with. 700 years is longer than the time between Columbus and today. This was not a camp or a passing settlement. This was home for dozens of generations, a place where families were born, grew old, and were buried in the same red earth their great-grandparents had farmed. For most of that history, the people did not live in the cliffs at all. They lived on top of the mesa, in pit houses dug into the ground, and later in villages of stacked stone and mud. They were farmers, and they were good at it. They grew corn, beans, and squash, the three crops that fed almost every civilization in the ancient Americas. They stored water. They built check dams and reservoirs to catch every drop of rain that fell on the high ground. They terraced the slopes. Over centuries, they turned a marginal, dry, unforgiving landscape into a working agricultural machine, and that machine produced something powerful, a surplus. Here is where the economic story really begins, and here is where the textbook version starts to fall apart. When you can grow more food than you need to survive, everything changes. A surplus means some people no longer have to farm. It means specialists, potters, weavers, builders, priests, traders. It means population growth, because more food means more surviving children. And it means concentration, people gathering into larger and larger communities, because there is finally enough to hold them together. By the height of this civilization, the wider region held tens of thousands of people. This was one of the most densely populated places north of Mexico, and it ran on corn. But no economy in a place this dry runs on corn alone. It runs on rain, and rain, in the high desert, is not a resource you control. It is a gamble you make every single spring. To feed a growing population on unreliable rainfall, the people did something remarkable. They built a network. Roughly 150 miles to the south, in a place called Chaco Canyon, a system emerged that tied the whole region together. Chaco had massive stone buildings, some of them the largest structures in North America for centuries, with hundreds of rooms rising several stories high. Dead straight roads ran out from it across the desert for miles, roads so wide and so deliberate that people still argue about what they were really for. Chaco was a hub. Turquoise flowed in and out of it. Pottery, timber, dragged from mountains 50 miles away, and even scarlet macaws carried all the way from the tropics of Mexico ended up in its rooms. This was trade. This was a regional economy with a center and a periphery, with something close to a ruling class, with organized religion and organized labor. consider what a single one of those macaws actually represents. A scarlet macaw is a tropical bird. It does not fly to Colorado. For one to end up in a room in the high desert, someone had to carry it, alive, in a cage, across more than 1,000 miles of mountain and desert, feeding it and keeping it warm the entire way, and someone on the other end had to want it badly enough to pay for it. That is not a lucky accident. That is a supply chain. That is a demand strong enough and a network organized enough to move a living luxury good across the length of an entire region. Multiply that by the turquoise pried out of distant mines, the salt, the cotton, the seashells hauled up from the coast of the Pacific, the tens of thousands of ceramic vessels traded from valley to valley, and you are not looking at a handful of villages. You are looking at a working market with tastes and status symbols and long-distance commerce run entirely on foot without a single wheel or pack animal. Everything moved on human backs. Every road was walked, and they built it anyway. Think about what that actually means. These were not scattered villagers scratching at the dirt. This was a connected society with a division of labour, long-distance exchange, monumental public works, and a shared belief system that held it all in place. When people online tell you the folks who lived here were primitive, or that they could not possibly have built what they built, they are not describing the evidence. They are describing their own assumptions. The evidence describes an economy. It is worth stopping on this point, because a whole industry of nonsense has grown up around places like this. You have probably seen it. The videos and the message boards insisting that the real builders were some vanished super-civilization, some lost advanced race that was erased from the record, because surely the ancestors of ordinary native people could not have raised towers and roads and traded macaws across 1,000 miles. Strip away the mystical packaging and look at what that claim actually is. It is the oldest move in the book, taking the achievements of a people and handing them to someone else. But there is nothing to hand off. The tools that shape these stones are in the walls. The tree ring dates say exactly when each beam was cut. The pottery styles evolve gradually, generation by generation, exactly as a living tradition does, with no seam where a mysterious lost empire suddenly steps in or steps out. The builders signed their work in 1,000 quiet ways, and their descendants are still here to claim it. The only thing that ever went missing from this story was the credit. And every economy, no matter how impressive, has a weakness. This one had two. The first was that it depended completely on a climate it could not predict. The second was that it kept growing, and growth in a fragile place is a debt that eventually comes due. Now, something happened around the year 1150 that should have been a warning. The Chaco system, that great regional hub, fell apart. There had been a serious drought in the mid-1100s, and when the rains failed, the whole centre of gravity collapsed. The great houses were slowly abandoned, but the people did not disappear then either. They shifted north. The population moved toward the better watered high country, toward places like Mesa Verde and the canyons around it. For a while, this worked. The north became the new heartland. The 1200s were, in many ways, a golden age up here. And this is exactly when the cliffs come into the story. For 700 years these people had lived on top of the mesa, out in the open, close to their fields. Then, in the last few decades of their time here, roughly the 1200s, they did something that has puzzled people ever since. They moved down off the mesa top and into the alcoves, into the cliffs. They built the structures we now come to see. Cliff Palace with its 150 rooms tucked under a great stone overhang, balcony house perched on a ledge you can barely reach, square tower house, spruce tree house, dozens more. They hauled sandstone and mud and water down into these hollows in the rock and built entire towns inside them, some only reachable by hand and toe holds carved into sheer cliff faces. Stand inside one of these places and the ambition of it hits you. Cliff Palace is not a hut. It is a town. More than 150 rooms and around 24 kivas packed under a single curving vault of sandstone, walls plastered and painted, towers rising 4 stories, a whole community stacked and interlocked like a honeycomb in the rock. The kivas, those round sunken chambers, were the spiritual engine of every village, roofed over, entered by a ladder through a hole in the top, with a small pit in the floor called a sipapu that represented the place their ancestors first emerged into this world. Every stone in these buildings was quarried by hand, shaped with harder stone, and set with mortar the people mixed and carried. Every roof beam was a tree felled with a stone axe and dragged for miles. And, all of it, every jar of water and every basket of corn had to be lifted up and down, cliffs on ladders, and on hand and toe holds chipped into vertical rock, day after day, year after year, with children and elders making the same climb. Nobody chooses that kind of daily labour for comfort. You only accept it when the thing you are climbing away from is worse. Why? Why would a farming people abandon easy access to their own fields and wedge themselves into cliffs where you have to climb a rock wall just to get home with a jar of water on your back? The comfortable answer is that the alcoves were sheltered, warmer in winter, cooler in summer, with natural water seeps in the back, and that is partly true. But it does not explain the defensive positions. It does not explain why so many of these villages sit in places that are almost impossible to attack and almost impossible to reach. You do not build your home on a ledge behind a cliff for the view. You build it there when you are afraid of something. And by the middle of the 1200s, there was plenty to be afraid of, because the Golden Age was already cracking underneath them. Here is what the simple drought story misses. The problem was never just a lack of rain in one bad year. The problem was that centuries of success had quietly eaten away at the foundation. Think about what 700 years of farming and firewood and building does to a fragile landscape. The forest thinned, because every house needs roof beams, and every winter needs fuel. Archaeologists can see it in the wood the people used. Early on they cut big timber from nearby. Later they were dragging smaller and smaller trees from farther and farther away, a classic signature of a resource being used up faster than it can grow back. The soil, farmed for generation after generation, lost its richness. The deer and the game, hunted by a rising population, grew scarce. People started eating more and more turkey, birds they raised themselves, because the wild meat was running thin. This is the part that makes it an economic story and not just a weather report. The society had grown right up to the edge of what the land could support. In good years, with good rain, the system worked, barely. It had no cushion left, no slack, no margin for error. An economy running at the absolute limit of its resources is not strong. It is brittle. It looks powerful right up until the moment it shatters. And then the rain stopped. Between 1276 and 1299, the region was hit by what scientists now call the Great Drought, 23 years of failing rains. And we are not guessing about this. This is one of the places where science gives us something close to a photograph of the past. In the early 1900s, an astronomer named Andrew Douglas was studying sunspots and needed a record of past climate. He realized that trees keep one. Every year a tree grows a ring. In a wet year, the ring is fat. In a dry year, it is thin. Line up enough overlapping timber, living trees and ancient beams from the ruins themselves, and you can build a calendar that runs back for well over 1,000 years, ring by ring, dry year by dry year. It is called tree ring dating, and the American Southwest is where it was born. And here is what makes it almost miraculous. Because each beam in each ruin carries this fingerprint of fat and thin years, and because no two stretches of years have exactly the same pattern, a beam can be matched to the master calendar and pinned to a precise year. Not roughly, not give or take a century. The actual year a specific tree was cut down, 700 or 800 years ago, read straight off the wood in someone's living room ceiling. We can tell you which decades the building boom happened in. We can tell you the exact year construction on some of these rooms stopped cold and never resumed. History rarely hands us that kind of precision, but here it did, and the pattern it revealed was chilling. The last cutting dates cluster in the 1270s and early 1280s, and then, across a whole region the size of a small country, they simply stop. No new beams, no new rooms. The construction of an entire civilization flatlines within a single generation. Those rings tell us the drought was real and it was brutal. But here is the twist that revisionists have been pointing out for decades, and that the science backs up. This was not the first bad drought these people had survived. They had weathered dry spells before, including one that was arguably worse in raw terms back in the 1100s. A hardy, resilient society at the top of its game should have been able to grind through 20 bad years. So why did this drought, and not the earlier ones, break them completely? Because this time, the society underneath the drought— before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. Because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Was already exhausted. The forests were gone. The soil was tired. The game was hunted out. The population was packed in tight with no room to spread out and no surplus to fall back on. When you are running at the edge, you do not need a catastrophe to fall. You just need one more push. The Great Drought was the push. It did not create the collapse. It triggered a collapse that centuries of overuse had already made inevitable. The drought was the spark. The society had been soaked in gasoline for 100 years. And when a tightly packed economy runs out of food, it does not fail quietly. It fails violently. This is the part of the story that got left out of the gentle, mysterious version, and it is the part the cliff dwellings themselves are screaming at us. Remember those defensive positions, those villages tucked into unreachable ledges, those towers with clear lines of sight. In the 1200s, as the resources ran thin, the evidence of violence in this region does not just appear, it explodes. Archaeologists have excavated villages that were attacked and burned. They have found sites where dozens of people, men, women, and children, were killed in what looked like single, catastrophic events. At places like Castle Rock and Sand Canyon, the bones tell stories of massacres. There is evidence of fighting, of people struck down and left where they fell, of communities that ended not with a slow fading but with a slaughter. When the surplus vanishes, the social contract that the surplus paid for vanishes with it. The specialists, the priests, the leaders, the whole delicate arrangement that let thousands of people live shoulder to shoulder in peace, all of it depended on there being enough to go around. Take away the enough, and neighbours become competitors. Competitors become raiders. The same tight network that made this society rich in the good years turned it into a pressure cooker in the bad ones. Everyone crammed together, everyone hungry, everyone armed. The cliffs were not a lifestyle choice. They were a last resort. People pulled back into the rock because the open mesa top was no longer safe, and even the rock could not save them. Look closely at how the late villages were built, and the fear is written into the stone. Towers went up with slit windows angled to watch the approaches. Villages clustered around single defensible springs because control of water had become a matter of life and death. Some communities walled themselves onto boulders and pinnacles reachable only by ladders that could be pulled up behind you. This is the architecture of a siege, and the skeletons from this final century back it up in the grimmest way possible. At certain sites, archaeologists have uncovered entire populations that died together and violently, bodies left unburied where they fell, cut marks and shattered skulls, telling of attacks that wiped out whole villages in a matter of hours. There is even bitterly disputed evidence, at a place called Cowboy Wash, of starving people driven to the last taboo of all, though experts still argue fiercely over what those bones really mean. Whatever the truth of that particular site, the larger picture is not in doubt. The last decades of Mesa Verde were not peaceful. They were a slow-motion emergency, and the people living through it knew it. So now put yourself in that world. You are a farmer in one of these cliff villages in the 1270s. Your parents remember better years. Every spring you plant, and the rains come late or not at all. The stream beds are dry. The stored corn is running low, and there is not enough to plant next year and eat this winter both. Your cousins in the next canyon were attacked last summer. The old ceremonies that were supposed to bring the rain have failed, year after year, and the priests who led them have run out of answers. The whole world your family built over 700 years is grinding to a halt around you. What do? You leave. And this is the single most important thing to understand about Mesa Verde, the fact that turns the whole mystery inside out. The people did not die out. They left. There is a world of difference between those two things, and the difference is everything. For a long time, the popular story treated this like a vanishing. A great civilization that mysteriously disappeared, poof, gone, leaving empty cities behind like the Mary Celeste found drifting with the tables still set. That framing is powerful, and it sells. It is also completely false, and it does real harm, because it erases people who are still alive. The descendants of the people who built these cliff dwellings did not evaporate into legend. They walked south, and they walked east, and their descendants are living in the southwest right now. The Hopi on their mesas in Arizona, the people of Zuni, the 24 pueblos strung along the Rio Grande in New Mexico, Acoma, Taos, and the rest. These are not distant relatives. Their own oral histories tell of migration, of clans moving from ancestral homes in the north to the places they live today. The archaeology and the tree rings agree with them. As Mesa Verde emptied in the 1270s and 1280s, the villages of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi country swelled with new people at exactly the same time. You can watch one region drain and another fill, like water moving between two basins. Listen to how the descendants themselves tell it, because they have never treated this as a mystery. In Hopi tradition, the people are the product of long migrations, clans leaving ancestral villages in stages and journeying to the places they were meant to settle, and specific ruins across the north are remembered not as the homes of strangers, but as the footprints of their own ancestors along the way. These are not vague folk memories. They are detailed, place-by-place accounts of movement, and for a long time the scholars who studied Mesa Verde barely bothered to ask the people whose grandparents had walked out of it. When they finally did, the oral histories and the excavated evidence lined up. The trowel and the tree ring were confirming what the elders had been saying for centuries, and the population math seals it. When you count up the people vanishing from the Mesa Verde region in the late 1200s and compare it to the villages of the northern Rio Grande and the Hopi Mesas, you find those southern communities exploding in size at precisely the same moment. New rooms, new plazas, new pottery styles, carrying northern influences, appearing right on schedule. People did not evaporate. They arrived somewhere. You can trace the movement in the ceramics, in the architecture, in the very DNA of the maize they carried with them and kept planting. The north emptied and the south filled, and the timing is not a coincidence. It is the same story told from both ends. They did not lose their civilization. They relocated it. They carried their seeds, their stories, their gods, and their knowledge to new ground with more reliable water, and they rebuilt. The line was never broken. It bends south and it keeps going, all the way to the present day. So why did they leave the pots on the floor? Why the sandals by the door, the corn in the storeroom, the sealed doorways? If this was a decision and not a disaster, why does it look like everyone stepped out for a minute and never returned? There are a few answers, and they are more interesting than any ghost story. Part of it is simple economics of moving. When you are walking 100 miles or more across desert to start over, you carry what is precious and light and useful. Seeds, turquoise, sacred objects, tools you cannot easily replace. You do not haul heavy clay storage jars up a cliff and across 100 miles of nothing. You leave them. A pot is worthless compared to the water you would spend carrying it. So the heavy, the broken, the ordinary, all of it stays behind, not because people fled in terror, but because that is simply what you abandon when you migrate on foot and travel light. But part of it is something deeper, and this is where the sealed doorways come in. For many of these people, leaving was not just practical, it was ceremonial. There is good reason to think that some of these homes and kivas, the round ceremonial chambers at the heart of every village, were deliberately, ritually closed. Some were burned on purpose as the people left, a formal ending, a way of saying this chapter is finished and it will not be reopened. Sealing a room, closing a village, was a way of honouring it and releasing it at the same time. The pots left in place may not be the litter of a panic. They may be, in part, offerings, a house put to rest. That reframes the whole eerie image, doesn't it? The empty rooms are not a crime scene. They are more like a grave that was tended with care before the family moved away. The people did not run from Mesa Verde screaming. They said goodbye to it. Now, this is a documentary, and I want to be honest with you about what we do not know, because the honest gaps are more compelling than any invented certainty. We do not know exactly how fast it happened. The best evidence suggests it was not a single day but a wave, playing out over roughly a generation, from the 1260s into the 1280s, with the pace picking up sharply at the end. We do not know exactly how much was drought, how much was warfare, how much was the pull of new religions and new opportunities to the south, and how much was simply that, once your neighbours start leaving, staying becomes impossible. A community only works if enough people stay to make it work. The moment that unravels, the exits cascade. Everyone leaving makes it more rational for the next family to leave too. Collapse, in the end, can be a stampede for the doors that no single person chose and no single person could stop. And there is a pull factor we should not ignore, because it complicates the pure doom and gloom version. Right around this time, a new religious movement was spreading in the Rio Grande region and among the ancestors of the Hopi. We see it in the sudden appearance of new imagery, Kachina figures, painted on pottery and kiva walls. A new spiritual world was being born to the south, one built around rain and fertility and community, exactly the things a drought-stricken people would be desperate for. It is entirely possible that Mesa Verde did not only push its people away. Somewhere over the horizon, a new way of living and believing was pulling them toward it. People do not just flee the dying, they walk toward the living. Put all of it together, and the tidy textbook sentence, "A drought killed the Anasazi," dissolves into something far richer. This was not a mystery, and it was not a miracle. It was a system. A civilization that turned a hard land into a surplus and used that surplus to grow, and kept growing until it had spent down every reserve the land had to give. Forests, soil, game, water, and finally the social trust that held it all together. When the climate turned, there was nothing left in the account. The bill for 700 years of success came due all at once, and it was paid in violence, in hunger, and finally in the hardest currency of all, in leaving. If that sounds familiar, it should. This is one of the oldest economic patterns there is. A society finds a formula that works, rides it to the absolute limit, mistakes the good years for permanent ones, and forgets that it is living on borrowed margin. The people of Mesa Verde were not primitive, and they were not foolish. They were sophisticated engineers and farmers and traders who did exactly what growing, successful societies do. They optimized. They filled every acre. They cut down the safety net one beam at a time because each beam, on its own, was needed. And by the time the whole thing was clearly fragile, they were already trapped at the top of it, with nowhere to go but down or out. They chose out. And that choice, painful and enormous as it was, is the reason their descendants are alive to tell the story today. That is the twist the mystery version robs them of. Leaving Mesa Verde was not a failure. In the coldest, clearest economic terms, it was the most successful decision they ever made. They cut their losses. They abandoned sunk costs that would have killed them, the way a person walks away from a beautiful house they can no longer afford, and they invested what remained, their people and their knowledge, in ground that could actually sustain them. A civilization that could not adapt in place, adapted by moving. The cliffs died so the people could live. So the next time you see a photograph of Cliff Palace glowing in the afternoon sun, empty and silent under its great arch of stone, try to see past the ghost story. Those empty rooms are not proof of a people who vanished, and they are certainly not proof of some lost race that supposedly built what the real builders could not. They are the fingerprints of a decision. A hard, collective, generation-long decision to let go of a place that had run out of second chances. The pots on the floor are not a mystery. They are a message. They say we were here. We built something extraordinary. We pushed it too far, and when the reckoning came, we were wise enough and brave enough to walk away and begin again somewhere new. The people who left their pots on the floor did not disappear into the desert. They walked into the future, and the smoke from those last ceremonial fires, drifting up out of the cliffs in the 1280s, was not the end of a civilization at all. It was the sound of one deciding, against everything, to survive.